second week of our Christmas series, and I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are already thinking, it's too early, right? Some of you think it is too early to be talking about Christmas, too early to have your decorations up. If that's you, give me a wave of your hand. Give me a wave of your hand if it's you in Ipswich. If you're online, I can't see you, but I've got people to tell me. I've been canvassing opinion this week about whether it's too early to have your Christmas decorations up. And I've discovered that it is too early to have Christmas songs on in the East Community Learning Disability Team office. But my favorite coffee shop, Kofra, has their tree up already. And I spoke to the person, the barista, and I asked them about this, and they said that it was the right time for retail, but too early to have your tree up at home. Which my wife has completely ignored. I came home one day and our tree was up. No discussion in our household. That's how things work. But it's beautiful to see the lights up in it through the city. If you've been in the city, all the decorations are up there. The lights are up. I often run through the city centre and I was enjoying seeing all the decorations as I was running through the city. But I saw something I've seen over the last few years that I find really challenging actually when I'm out there and I'm running through the city. That was to see how many people are sleeping in the doorways of the shops that have these beautiful decorations up. And I find something so challenging to think that it's in this time of family and this time of love, this time of acceptance and warmth, there are people who are sleeping on our streets. When I think about all of the money that has been paid for those beautiful decorations in the heart of Norwich, I think about the money that is going to be spent in those shops, and there are people who can't afford to keep a roof over their head. And it raises one of the challenges, I think, of Christmas. One of the things that maybe we ignore, one of the things that I want to talk about today is the injustice that we sometimes see at Christmas time. And this is something that seems to be up there in the consciousness at the moment, and not only because of Christmas, but also because we've got a World Cup going on, a Winter World Cup for like the first time ever. But there have been all sorts of questions. The comments have not just been about football, but they've also been about issues of justice. There have been questions about the way that Qatar won the bidding process. That was way back when. Most recently, there have been questions about the way that homosexuality is treated in the nation of Qatar. And in the middle of that, there have been all sorts of concerns about the treatment of migrant workers, thousands of whom have died in the process of building the stadia and infrastructure that have set up this World Cup. And there are others who would say that those criticisms are misplaced, or who would ask who we are as European nations to ask questions about the human rights record or impose our culture on another country. Some have said that that's discrimination, that that's Islamophobia, especially when you think about how the British approach to colonization helped set the platform for our success as a nation. So there are issues of injustice when it comes to the football. There were issues of injustice in England's first game, which was against Iran. The Iranian players didn't sing their own national anthem as a protest to what's been going on in their country. And there were questions too about the England players who opted to take the knee to continue to raise awareness about racism. And there were those online and commentators who were asking questions about whether it was still necessary for them to make this stance, to take the knee, to raise the issue of racism. And I wonder if those were the same people who were using their social media channels to make death threats to young black footballers when they missed penalties at the European Championships. There's a lot of injustice this Christmas time, isn't there? And that's before we get on to the war in Ukraine. That's before we think about asylum seekers and all of the debate about migrant crossing, and that's before we think about the cost of living crisis and how right it is that energy companies are earning big profits in the midst of a rise in the cost of living. And some of you might be thinking, oh, come on, Phil. Hang on a minute, mate. What are you doing? It's Christmas. Could you not just bring us an inspiring Christmas message? Do you have to talk about this stuff? This is starting to feel more like a current affairs show than it is a Sunday message. Do you have to talk about this kind of stuff on that platform? But I think that I do. With two reasons, really. One of which is that we have always been committed to being a relevant church. And being a relevant church doesn't just mean that we have contemporary music on our playlist and we know when to set aside our skinny jeans. Being a relevant church means that we're talking about the things that are actually going on in our world. And the second reason that I think we need to talk about this is because underneath the glitz and the glamour of Christmas, when you get back to the Christmas account, you will find that there is some injustice hiding there as well. If you want to read along with me, we're going to look at what it says in Matthew chapter 2. And it'll be behind me on the screen. We're going to read just after the visit of the Magi. So the Magi have been the wise men from the east who have come to Jesus carrying gifts of great value. You've probably seen this scene depicted on Christmas cards or in school nativity plays. But right after that comes a bit that I don't think makes it onto many Christmas cards. Let me read it to you from Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13. It says this, it says, when they, the Magi, had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Has anyone seen that in the school nativity play? It isn't easy reading, is it? As a father of a 1-year-old, I can tell you that this passage hits differently this year. To be clear on the context, Herod is the nominal king of Israel. I say nominal because he had the title but not much power. Israel was occupied by the Romans, and Herod was a sham ruler, a puppet of a more powerful regime. But he was terrified of losing his position. So when these scholars, these stargazing noble mystics from the east, came looking for a new king, Herod began to fear for his position. Not only that, but his own learned men found out that there were prophecies of a Messiah that lined up with the Magi's expectation. So Herod is convinced that someone is coming to steal his throne, and he takes drastic, tragic action. Having failed to convince the Magi to show him the one child they find, outwitted by wise men, he commands that all of the boys under 2 in Bethlehem be put to death. Can you imagine the pain felt by that community? Can you imagine the utter torment as soldiers go from one home to another, killing every baby boy that they find? No wonder the cries of the mothers were such that the prophet Jeremiah foretold their sound. So how then do we reconcile this tragedy with our understanding of Christmas? How do we square this with our picturesque nativity that we long for? What does this teach us about our modern day search for justice? Well, firstly, this passage forces us to confront the full extent of humanity's depravity, the reaches of man's inhumanity to man. Herod's callous actions show us the dangers, the risks of unchecked ambition, unbridled jealousy, and power wielded in the absence of good character. And if we think those challenges are in the past, we're probably deceiving ourselves. Yet Herod's actions in some ways are of their time. These are in the days before the concept of human rights, before a sense of equity and equality, when powerful men did as they wished and ruthlessness was an accepted necessity for those who sought to maintain power. But secondly, we should look to God in this. Where is the justice of God in the massacre of children? Where is the love of God in those who died without cause? What could God know about the seemingly senseless sacrifice of a child? Those of you more familiar with the Christian account perhaps see where this is going. Because God's own son may have escaped that massacre, but he would in time give his life at the hands of unrighteous men. Right here is a foreshadowing of the sacrifice that Jesus would offer on our behalf as he gave his life some 30-odd years later. Jesus came to save us from our shortcomings, to clear away the stuff that should separate us from God. He came for all the times that we've gone astray. He lived the perfect, sinless life to show us the full extent of human possibility, to help us to see what life looked like when lived in lockstep with Father God. And he gave his life in our place to make it possible for us to know that relationship ourselves. I doubt that many of us will feel an affinity with Herod's murderous urges. But we likely all know times when we have lived a life that is less than our best. We've all had times when we've behaved in a way that brought us guilt and shame, conducted ourselves in a way that we regret. There is no way for us to get back there to God. So God came to get us. Jesus, the Son of God, God with skin on, came to do what we could not. He came to give his life on our behalf. So Jesus is the counterpoint to the injustice that we see here. He is the answer to the tyranny and the trouble of our world. He is the Prince of Peace. He is the light that shines in the darkness. He is the hope when all seems lost. The first step to answering injustice is to recognize that God feels our pain. The second is to see that he did not leave us to suffer it alone. And the third is to turn our attention to the only viable solution to the problems that we face: Jesus. In every year, when it comes to our Christmas special, we begin to think about what songs to sing, how to keep it fresh and interesting. So I got in the habit of trawling through carols, hoping that I'll have something of use to bring to those meetings. I remember a few years ago now, pre-pandemic, I found a song that talked about this account. It's too sad and melancholic to make it into our Christmas special, but let me read to you the lyrics nonetheless. Come now and hear the sound of mothers gathered round. Tears are streaming down in Bethlehem, grieving life that did not have to end. Asking God to justify the pain, never knowing he would feel the same. The powerful oppress the prophecy, but shepherds passing through have found a king. Rumor has it that a child is born, and it's said that we will call him Lord. Heaven's angels came to let us know that our freedom rests upon his throne. So we've traveled from across this land, seeking out the new and precious Lamb, the one who came and made time stand still when heaven opened up at God's own will. Now forever we will sing the song of the one who was and is to come. All creation joins in harmony in declaring he is perfectly holy, holy, merciful and mighty. God has sent the Savior of the world. God sends his Son to bring us salvation, the fullness of a relationship with God. Salvation for the Magi, salvation for the mothers crying for the loss of their children, salvation for the shepherds, salvation for all who would call on his name since. Salvation is not just about a moment of decision, not just about a moment of connecting with Jesus. Salvation is about life, a life of peace, freedom, love and acceptance and purpose and meaning, a life lived in relationship with God. And if we want to understand how to answer injustice off the back of this message of peace, we need to look again at just what it means to live out our salvation as well. Which brings us back to a passage of the Bible that we talked about last Sunday evening. In Luke 19, we read of Jesus 30 years on from then, much older, weeping as he looks to the future of Jerusalem. It says this, it says, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come to you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. As I shared last Sunday, that was prophetic then, but is the distant past now. These terrifying words of Jesus came to pass less than 50 years after he spoke them in AD 70, when the Romans tore down, burned down the temple along with the rest of Jerusalem. In response to a rebellious uprising in the land, I mistakenly ascribed that action to a Roman governor last Sunday night, but actually it was Titus, son of the then emperor, a future emperor himself. And it's not clear whether he actually commanded for Jerusalem to be torn down, but it was burned to the ground nonetheless. This passage warrants a second look, not because I researched it for last Sunday and I want to make the most of it, but because it speaks to the fundamental question of how we address injustice. You see, the Jews were expecting a Messiah that was a mighty warrior. They were expecting one who would free them from Roman oppression by military might. Jesus was not what they were expecting at all. As Jesus' words here indicate, they missed it. What is it that Jesus says? He says, if you had only known what would bring you peace. And Jesus is surely speaking about himself, because he is the Prince of Peace. He is the answer to the anxiety of trying to work our way back to God. He is the one who stills the stirring of a troubled soul. He is the one who says that we can stop our stressing and our striving and know that we are loved. He is the one who answers the nagging voice of guilt and shame with the love and forgiveness and acceptance that is more than we could ever hope for. Maybe there are some of us today who have missed what will bring us peace. Perhaps Jesus doesn't just mean himself. Perhaps Jesus means his way too. Because the Jews were looking for a military man. They were looking for one who would lead them into battle. But the Messiah came instead to lay down his life. Maybe Jesus doesn't only offer peace personified. Maybe he promises a pathway to peace that looks radically different to the one that was outlined by the world around him. Maybe Jesus is offering us another way. Maybe Jesus' answer to the injustice we face is different to what we are expecting. The Jesus way certainly runs contrary to the destructive approach taken by Herod. It was contrary to the might of the Roman Empire. And it would prove far more enduring than this rebellion that was stirred up 40 years later by more conventional heroes. Jesus offers a response to injustice that will probably sit uneasily with us today. Because Jesus harshly criticizes his religious opponents, perhaps because their actions prevent people from coming back to God. But when it comes to the oppression of the Romans, Jesus' response is markedly different. He speaks of turning the other cheek, of going the extra mile, of giving up your cloak, of praying for and even loving our enemies. Our modern response to injustice is to rise up and fight back. But how does that correlate with a Savior prepared not to stand up, but to lay down his life? Last Sunday, I spoke about how we should avoid polarization in a world that increasingly tries to pull us to the extremes of political debate. And some understandably asked whether we should not rise up for certain causes, whether or not causes that should cause us to take a stand, whether we shouldn't push back against the prevailing culture and raise our voice in defense of the oppressed. And such questions are well placed, but the answer is not straightforward. Because Jesus isn't calling us to present a better argument or a sterner resistance. Jesus calls us to demonstrate a better way to live. To quote a military man who would come centuries after Jesus, Napoleon Bonaparte said, "Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires, but on what did we rest the creations of our genius? Humble. Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour millions of men would die for him." Napoleon's comments demonstrate the extent of Jesus' impact on those that would say that they follow him, but what Napoleon underestimated was the impact that those followers would have upon Western thought. Because Jesus' teaching had a profound impact upon Western ethics and morality. If you take the example of Herod from earlier, we find those actions abhorrent in our context only because of the influence of Jesus' followers on the way that we now think. In Jesus' day, there were cultures where it was perfectly acceptable for the powerful to leverage force to maintain their position, where babies had very little value, where the rights of those lower down the social ladder were considered entirely subservient to those in authority. Our modern ideas of equality, of the sanctity of life, of the importance of justice for all, these were all based upon Jesus and his teaching. Human rights stem from our understanding that there is something of value in every person. That stemmed from the idea that we each carried a spark of the divine, that we were a reflection of God himself. Evolutionary biology does not get you to that point. Instead, it would reinforce exactly the approach that Herod takes here, to kill off the weakness and maintain your own power. This was something that was lived out by cultures like the Spartans, whose influence over the years has faded as the influence of Jesus' followers has grown. Now, I don't want this message to end up feeling too highbrow or overly intellectual, so I'm not going to explore those arguments in full. But my primary point is that Jesus called his followers to a different way to live. He was not a man of war. He was the Prince of Peace. His impact upon our culture was unparalleled, that his example rings through the ages, that it marked a sea change in how we see others. But that cultural shift was driven by those who followed Jesus. People who, like those of us in this room or in Ipswich or watching online, who called themselves followers of Jesus, who changed their world and rose up against the injustice that they saw by living radically different lives to those around them. Last Sunday, we spoke about 5 distinctive values that set apart the early church. Values that are identified first by a historian called Larry Hurtado and has been refined by pastors and authors like Timothy Keller and John Mark Comer. And what they spoke about was how these 5 values, which to us might seem pretty standard today, were the antithesis of the culture that early Christians found themselves in. They were completely different to the way that other people lived. And these were the things that marked the Christian church as different. These were what made it attractive. This was how they changed the world. So these weren't just intellectual talking points. This was a framework for how they lived. They placed a very high value on diversity, equality, and inclusion. So all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds were welcome within the church. There was a value also on socioeconomic differences. Rich and poor, slave and free, rubbed shoulders together in that community. Sex was enjoyed within the context of a monogamous relationship that endured until death. This set them apart from the rest of the Roman world, which had a very different approach to sexual ethics than the idea of a monogamous relationship where you remain faithful to one person. Also, the fight against infanticide, abortion, and an unwillingness to be in the military as a follower of Jesus. These are 2 areas that we will talk about in a minute. But what I want you to know and recognize about this list is that these things marked the early church as different. And they set in motion a cultural shift that still resonates in our world today. In other words, this Christian community, these early followers of Jesus, changed their world by living this way. What might that look like for us? What might it look like for us to live out similar values? How might this shape our response to injustice? We don't have time to explore all of these areas, so let's pick on the last 2. Let's take the last one first. What if we were known as a people of peace? Because the early Christians refused to join the military. They refused even to physically fight in the face of overwhelming persecution. Because in Jesus, they saw the Prince of Peace. And they saw his example, his way as a pathway of peace. Now for us today, we're probably not facing the prospect of military service or armed conflict. So what does it look like for us to live out these same values? Well, I think the answer is that we don't have to be drawn into fights in the forums that we do find ourselves as a part of. So we don't have to end up arguing with other people on social media. We don't have to get into conflict with others in the office. Instead of seeking to argue, we should follow their example and seek to promote peace and foster reconciliation. Now, some will understandably ask if there are not issues where we should speak up, if we should not argue back with ideas that we disagree with. And there is some value of speaking, yes, but there is much less value in arguing. Because our goal is not to get into a fight, it's to find common ground. How many people are won over by a better argument? Or by an argument made more loudly? Not many, right? I'm a debater. I argue with people all the time. I can tell you that some people just won't listen no matter how good your point is. How many times does canceling someone lead to reconciliation? How many times does it change their mind? Our goal is not to prove people wrong, it's to win them over. And a stance of engagement and compassion will serve us far better than even our best version of a fight. So if we want to stand up or respond to injustice in our world, we need to start off as a people of peace. And the second thing that we need to be is a help to the helpless. Because another distinctive of the early Christians was this resistance to infanticide, abortion. So as I outlined last Sunday, abortion was very rare because it was incredibly risky. But what people did instead was, if they had babies that they didn't want, was they just left them outside, often around the city margins, and the child would die of exposure. until the Christians turned up. And the Christians went around scooping up the babies and adopting them and raising them as their own. Christians became known for this practice of standing up for the sanctity of life, not by shouting or arguing, but by going to the children and giving them a family to be a part of. Now, I don't think that we can equate this entirely with abortion. I think that medical science means that there are considerations that are too nuanced for us to go into the details of today. But I think there is an application for us here. Because when I was driving in, I haven't seen many babies that have been left outside in Norwich. But what does it mean for us to come alongside those in our society who are most vulnerable? What would it mean for us to step in to support those who have no voice? Because what is clear is that this Christian approach had a radical impact in its society. It didn't just mark the Christian community as different. It caused a shift in cultural value. The idea of leaving a baby outside to die is shocking to us today, but it wasn't then. That change in cultural understanding only came about because Christians were prepared to live differently. This was perhaps the profoundest expression of their belief in the sanctity of life. That shift towards human rights, that understanding that there is something special and valuable about every human, we can trace that back to this practice. But what we have to notice here is that this isn't about having a better argument. This is about loving with our actions more than with our words. The Christians didn't argue against infanticide. They were not out there in the debating arenas offering a philosophical rebuttal. Instead, they provided a radical solution, one that cost them no doubt, but that was the price they were prepared to pay to change their society. I don't think that our world needs more words about the inherent value of people. I think it needs a community to show how valuable people are. A community that accepts people wherever they're coming from, a community that loves people regardless of their background, a community that believes in people no matter what's going on. And if you think that's a distant, highbrow concept, that means crossing the atrium and having a conversation with someone that you have not met. It means inviting someone to your group or your home. It means saying to someone, would you like to serve with me, even if you're not sure that you're going to get on. How do we love the most vulnerable? How can we help the helpless? What does it mean to adopt their cause? In what ways can our community model a radically different way to live? I don't have all the answers. I bet there are people in this room who do. I bet there are people in Ipswich who do. I bet there are people online who can think of ways that we can help those who have no voice. Before I close, I want to suggest one practical application that we can all do this week. Hampers. Our collection for our Love Norwich and Love Ipswich hamper appeal ends next Sunday, the 4th of December. After that, we're going to pack those hampers and send them out into our world. It is how we help the most vulnerable. It is how we leverage generosity. It shows that we are a community that comes together to show that all are loved by God. This is a way to represent all 5 of those things we talked about. I mean, it might not say a lot about our attitude to sex, but it will say a lot about the strength of our relationships as we come together in our groups and our teams and as families to pack and to give. Perhaps that is the first step in answering the injustice that we see at Christmas. Perhaps it is to do something for those for whom this is a difficult time of year, to show them that they are seen and valued, that they are appreciated and loved. What if, in a time of economic uncertainty, we saw our greatest ever response? My prayer is that as we have spoken about a couple of these values that define the early church, we have begun to see how they might define our best version of community, that we have glimpsed what it might look like to live differently. This is not about the intellectual argument. This is about shifting culture through our lived example. It may begin in a study of our past, but it finds its life in the here and now. This is what a response to injustice might look like today, to live differently to the world around us. And perhaps over the Advent period, we might reflect on how some of those values might shape our lives again. As I finish, I hope today that I have made you a bit uncomfortable. I hope that I've drawn our attention to this uncomfortable aspect of the Christmas account. one that prompts a response to the injustice that is still as prevalent in our world as it was then. I hope we've seen the value not of a better argument or of sterner resistance, but of going beyond all that to offer a better way to live. Because the core of all of this is Jesus, the Prince of Peace, who stood in stark contrast to the kings who went before him. In him we find peace personified. Through his example, we find a pathway to peace and justice in our world. Through this Christmas period, let's commit to representing him more fully. We know what it is that brings peace. Let's shine that light into our dark, troubled world.